It is strange how certain stories feel unfinished, as if someone long ago brushed away the details and left us only with silhouettes that flicker at the edge of memory. Australia's ancient beds of stone and dust carry that same muted weight. Giant forms hinted by a femur here, a tooth there, a claw mark sealed inside limestone, and between them, long intervals of quiet that make the entire prehistory feel interrupted. One wonders what kind of world existed before the silence settled. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you can, share where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. There is something unsettling about a land where everything we know begins in fragments. A continent where the oldest human cultures walked alongside creatures so large and strange that even comparison feels inadequate. Where a lion without a mane but with jaws like bolt cutters stalked the night, and where birds taller than a person laid eggs heavier than a child's head. Where crocodiles sprinted on long legs through eucalyptus shadows, and giant kangaroos moved in deliberate two-legged strides like sentinels patrolling a forgotten era. And yet the land remembers so little. The bones survive, scattered and sun-bleached, but the story that should connect them has thinned to threads. The more one studies the early landscape of Australia, the more one senses that something has been erased. Not fully, not violently, simply removed, as if time skimmed across the continent and lifted away a layer of truth. Scientists piece together timelines, but the sediment layers disagree. Radiocarbon ages contradict optically stimulated luminescence. Footprints appear without context, and entire species vanish abruptly in a geological blink that feels too sharp, too synchronized to be simple chance. The continent, ancient and quiet, almost seems to look away whenever we try to reconstruct what lived here before the silence. In the land's oldest stories, passed through unbroken lines of memory for tens of thousands of years, there are descriptions of giant birds, giant reptiles, giant shapes that roamed plains now empty. The Dreamtime speaks of being so large the ground trembled under them. Some interpret these as metaphors, others as mythic personifications of landscape forces. Yet it is difficult not to notice the strange alignment between those oral memories and the bones dug from the earth. Memories and fossils that never consulted each other yet describe a world overflowing with giants. But even those memories break off at the same point where the fossil record does, tapering into vagueness, as though the stories too encountered a threshold where details could no longer cross. Why does so much of Australia's prehistory end around the same narrow slice of time, a corridor spanning perhaps 5,000 years, when so many megafaunal species, across different families, diets, and environments, vanished together? Climate shifts were slow. Extinctions were sudden. Human arrival is recorded early, but evidence of direct hunting remains sparse and controversial. Between these contradictions lies a shadowed uncertainty that has troubled researchers for decades. Consider the land as it once was. Rivers braided across floodplains now dry, inland lakes shimmering where deserts now grind under wind. Herds of Diprotodon, gentle colossi the size of small cars, moved slowly across open woodlands, their massive weight stamping deep impressions into mud that hardened into ancient tracks. Procoptodon, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood eye to eye with humans. Its gait remains a puzzle. Is it true, as some suggest, that it walked upright like a slow, deliberate giant? Or did it hop with controlled, powerful bounds that sent tremors across the ground? We cannot know, for their bones tell only part of a story, and the missing half remains sealed behind time. Then imagine the predators. Australia's silence hides their movements, but the marks remain. A single claw slash preserved in a cave wall in Victoria, attributed to Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion. The cut is deep, purposeful, too clean to be a random scrape. Nearby, bones of prey animals show unmistakable signs of powerful slicing teeth, as if the creature gripped and tore with a precision uncommon in marsupials. Why do so few of its skeletons remain for a predator once widespread? What eroded their presence so completely? And why does the disappearance of this apex hunter align so closely with the disappearance of its prey? The continent feels as if it were once the stage for an ancient drama whose script has decayed. Even the land predators that roamed beyond Thylacoleo leave strange contradictions. Quinkana, the terrestrial crocodile with legs long enough to run through forests, is known through scattered remains that feel unrepresentative of an animal supposedly thriving for millions of years. Megalania, the giant monitor lizard, perhaps venomous, remains even more elusive. A reptile estimated at 7 meters long should dominate a fossil record, but it does not. As though something interrupted the record itself, not only the species. In the quiet hours of research, scholars often speak about missing intervals, segments of time that leave surprisingly little trace, as if erosion sharpened its tools too precisely. But erosion is not selective. It does not erase only the giants. It does not target apex predators across different ecological niches. It does not remove simultaneously the browsers, the grazers, the flightless birds, the serpentine constrictors, the long-legged crocodilians. Yet here, at the far edge of the continent's deep time, we face a synchronized collapse that mimics a pattern but refuses to reveal its cause. And so the story of prehistoric Australia begins not with clarity, but with fog. A fog woven from partial truths, broken bones, and memories carried through tens of thousands of years, yet stopping short at the same horizon. It begins with the quiet acknowledgement that we know far less than we believe, and that the land itself may be withholding more than it shares. As we move deeper into this forgotten world, one question lingers like the dusk settling over ancient plains. Were these giants undone by nature, by humans, or by something more subtle? Some shift in the continent's rhythm that erased not just species, but the very evidence of their passing. The answer lies somewhere within the silence, waiting at the threshold of the next part, where the fragments of one predator, huge, elusive, and disputed, begin to shape the outline of a creature that should not have disappeared so quietly. There is a peculiar discomfort that arises whenever the bones of Megalania are mentioned, as if even the earth itself hesitates to confess what it once carried. The fragments that remain, vertebrae no larger than a palm, ribs like broken branches, a fossilized jaw whose angles hint more at a shadow than a certainty, do not match the creature described in reconstructions. A reptile said to stretch 7 meters or more should leave behind a trail of unmistakable ruin. Yet Megalania appears in the fossil record like a rumor, present enough to prove it existed, absent enough to make its scale uncertain. It is one thing for an animal to be large, another for it to be so large that it bends expectations, and still another for such an animal to leave behind almost nothing. The contradiction is stark. Here was a predator that dominated the land, a relative of the modern Komodo dragon, yet orders of magnitude more formidable. Its teeth were recurved and serrated, built not only to slash but to hold. Its claws hooked, its limbs powerful, its tail a weapon in its own right. Some researchers suggest it possessed venom glands like those of today's giant monitors, a trait that would have made even a shallow bite a death sentence. This should have been the continent's unquestioned apex hunter, a reptilian ruler whose presence overshadowed entire ecosystems. Yet the bones tell a different, quieter story, one interrupted by blank spaces and incomplete layers. Even its size has become an argument rather than a fact. Some models place Megalania at 23 feet. Others insist it was much smaller. The difference is not trivial. A 3-meter discrepancy could transform our understanding of its hunting strategies, its ecological role, and the threats it posed to the first humans who walked this land. Why, then, is such a creature known through fragments when smaller animals, less dominant and less widespread, have left richer fossil trails? Why does the record break exactly where we most need clarity? At times, it feels less like a natural absence and more like a story with missing pages. There are caves in Queensland and New South Wales where sediments preserve impressions of ancient fauna, yet Megalania seldom appears. There are deposits rich with Diprotodon bones, entire skeletons of those gentle giants, but the Great Monitor's remains come in irregular pieces. If it once hunted those massive herbivores, where are the marks? Where are the clusters of bones that predators usually leave behind? Why does its trail fade just as Australia's other megafauna begin to disappear? Some researchers attempt to fill the gaps with climate models. They speak of expanding aridity, shrinking waterholes, the slow tightening of the continent's dry grip. They suggest prey populations dwindled, pushing predators like Megalania past a threshold from which they could not recover. Yet climate change in Australia's late Pleistocene was gradual, unfolding over thousands of years. Extinction, on the other hand, was abrupt. There is a dissonance in that. A large predator should decline slowly alongside its prey. Instead, Megalania's disappearance is sudden, almost simultaneous with other giants, Thylacoleo, Genyornis, Procoptodon, as if the continent experienced a single, multi-species dimming. If humans played a role, one would expect clearer evidence. Megalania would have been an existential threat to early communities. A venomous giant lizard capable of running down prey on open ground would not have gone unnoticed. Yet there are no spears embedded in its bones, no rock art that unmistakably captures its form, no tales from surviving oral traditions that align perfectly with its presence. There are hints, yes, stories of giant reptiles, desert lizards taller than a man, beings that stalked the night. But hints are not proof. And even these stories feel older than their tellers, as though carried across generations from a time already fading when the first humans arrived. But it is the ecological silence that unsettles most. Apex predators leave signatures, predator-prey ratios, carcass sites, tooth-scored bones, territorial patterns written in sediment. Megalania leaves a faint, inconsistent signature, strong enough to confirm it once ruled, weak enough to question whether we are seeing its full shadow. It feels like an outline awaiting its form, a ghost drawn around empty air. The more researchers uncover, the more the creature retreats into ambiguity, as if the land does not wish to reveal the full truth of its former monarch. Consider the way its disappearance mirrors the collapse of other megafauna. The short-faced kangaroo fades. The marsupial lion fades. The giant bird fades. The massive land crocodile fades. Each begins strong in the record and then dissolves into the same narrow window of absence. Life does not unravel with such coordination, and yet here, on this ancient continent, it did. As though something whispered through the ecosystems, dimming the giants one by one. Some have suggested disease, an introduced pathogen spreading quickly among large-bodied species, but sparing smaller ones. Others consider catastrophic fire events, but charcoal layers do not match the scale required. Still others imagine a human-driven transformation so subtle that its evidence has been buried under millennia of dust and erosion. None of these theories fully align with the timing, and all leave unexplained the scarcity of Megalania's remains. So what remains? A creature that should have left behind dominating evidence, but instead left a puzzle. A predator whose bones whisper more than they declare, as though the earth swallowed most of its story before we ever had the chance to read it. A reptile large enough to alter the behavior of every other species around it, yet elusive enough that its presence feels almost like an echo. And so Megalania stands as a gateway into the deeper mystery of prehistoric Australia. Not simply why these giants existed, nor even why they disappeared, but why so much of the record surrounding them feels hollowed out. What force, not necessarily external, not necessarily violent, could cause a continent to forget so many of its most formidable creatures at once? What does it mean when history leaves only fragments of the dangerous, while preserving the gentle in greater detail? The silence surrounding Megalania is not empty. It is dense, layered, resisting. It invites the uneasy thought that we may be looking at a pattern we do not yet understand. A pattern that repeats across species and across regions with uncanny synchrony. And somewhere within that pattern lies the next riddle. A bird that towered above human height, that laid enormous eggs, that dominated the plains with thunderous steps, and yet vanished with the same abrupt finality. That is where the trail now leads, into the territory of the giant feathered shadows, where even the charred remains of their eggs hint at a story deeper than simple extinction. There is a quiet unease in the way the giant bird Genyornis enters the story of Australia's deep past. It does not stride into the fossil record with the confidence of a titan, nor does it leave behind the dense scatter of bones one might expect from a creature taller than a person and weighing more than 500 pounds. Instead, it appears as a presence felt through traces, burned fragments of eggshells, scattered footprints hardened in mudstone, a handful of skeletal remains that look more like abandoned clues than a coherent chapter of natural history. And yet, for thousands of years, this bird walked the continent with a mass and force that should have imprinted itself unmistakably upon the land. Why then does it feel more like a rumor carried forward by silence? The bird itself was formidable. A massive, flightless creature with legs built for powerful strides and a beak capable of crushing tough vegetation or delivering devastating blows. The shape of its skull, reconstructed from the fragments that survive, suggests a creature that relied heavily on strength rather than agility. Its body was dense, its center of gravity low, its limbs pillar-like. Some early descriptions compared it to a demon duck, not for any mythic qualities, but because its proportions seemed so unusual, so out of alignment with modern analogues. Genyornis was neither ostrich nor emu. It sat outside the familiar categories, occupying a space evolution rarely revisits. The most intriguing evidence of its existence, however, comes from the strange phenomenon of burnt eggshells scattered across ancient dunes and lake beds. These fragments, discovered in hundreds of locations across the continent, bear distinctive heat signatures. Not the high, uniform scorching of natural wildfires, but the uneven, localized carbonization consistent with controlled cooking. The shells are thick, heavy, and once held eggs nearly the size of footballs. Many scientists argue that humans roasted these eggs, breaking them open to reach the rich, nutrient-dense yolks inside. But the implications extend far beyond diet. If early inhabitants consumed these eggs regularly, it suggests a familiarity with the bird itself, a daily proximity to a creature large enough to tower over them. And yet, conspicuously, there is no direct evidence of hunting, no spear tips lodged in bone, no butchering marks on skeletons, no depictions etched into rock surfaces that clearly reveal its profile. The interactions, if they occurred, seem strangely indirect. To cook the eggs of a giant bird is not the same as slaying the bird. It implies knowledge of nesting sites, the ability to approach without provoking the parent, or perhaps the simple luck of encountering an unguarded clutch. But even this raises questions. Why would a creature of such size allow repeated harvesting of its offspring? Did it defend its nests? Or were nesting grounds abandoned under stress? Stress that might hint at the cause of its decline. Some researchers point to climate change, citing evidence that Australia's inland regions became increasingly arid around the time Genyornis disappeared. Reduced water sources, shrinking vegetation, and shifting ecosystems could certainly destabilize large-bodied, slow-reproducing animals. But climate change alone cannot explain the burned shells. Nor can it fully account for how abruptly the bird vanished. Species that succumb to environmental pressures usually fade gradually, leaving a declining trace in successive layers of sediment. Genyornis, in contrast, appears steadily for thousands of years and then drops away within a narrow temporal band that mirrors the disappearance of other megafauna. It is the synchrony that disturbs the narrative. There is also the striking uniformity of the burnt egg evidence. Locations separated by hundreds of miles show nearly identical patterns, as though a continent-wide behavior, human or environmental, affected the species at the same time. Some propose that intensive egg harvesting reduced recruitment, leading to population collapse. But this theory requires consistent, large-scale pressure across an enormous landscape, applied by early human groups who were dispersed, migratory, and deeply connected to local ecosystems. Could small groups of people have altered the reproductive success of a giant species so profoundly and so uniformly? Perhaps. But perhaps not. Even more mysterious is the absence of transitional fossils. The shells stop appearing abruptly, not gradually thinning out over time. The bird itself leaves no late-stage bones to mark a slow decline. There is instead an impression of erasure, a sudden break in continuity, a void where the creature should still be. This is not the signature of natural attrition. It is the signature of interruption. The land, as always, offers fragments, but not explanations. Footprints preserved along lake margins show sequences of three-toed impressions, some deep and forceful, spaced wider than a human stride. These prints tell of a powerful creature moving with deliberate intention. But such tracks end abruptly, without younger layers to follow. Fossils pulled from older sediments depict a thriving species, robust and adapted to its environment. And then, nothing. The narrative ends mid-sentence. The question grows heavier. What happened in this ancient interval that touched not just Genyornis, but so many giants? Climate? Humans? A confluence of both? Or something subtler? Something woven into the continent's shifts in water, vegetation, and fire cycles that left no clear trace. Whatever occurred, it threaded itself through ecosystems with uncanny precision, affecting large-bodied species across unrelated families. That is not typical. Extinction waves usually show uneven patterns. Some species fall, others rise. But here the pattern clusters around the giants, as though size itself became a vulnerability in a way previously unseen. The quiet stories carried through Aboriginal oral traditions speak of enormous birds, beings that strode across the plains with thunderous weight. Some stories describe giant eggs. Others speak of creatures that could kill with a single strike of their beaks. These stories overlap across regions that had no direct contact for tens of thousands of years, suggesting memories preserved longer than written history itself. But even these stories fade, their details dissolving as they approach the same threshold where the fossil record ends. It is as if memory and geology both encountered the same veil. Perhaps the most haunting truth is that the last evidence of Genyornis occurs at nearly the same moment, that isolated fragments of the marsupial lion, the land crocodile, the giant kangaroo, and the enormous reptiles begin to thin out. A continent losing its giants not one by one, but together. Not in the slow rhythm of natural selection, but with the swiftness of an unseen shift. And so the trail of Genyornis leads deeper into the growing fog of Australia's vanished titans. The next creature waiting in that fog stands as a contradiction of its own. A giant that moved like a sentinel, stood taller than most humans, and yet walked with a strange, upright posture that defies what we think we know about kangaroos. Its bones speak in fragments, its disappearance mirrors the others, and its silhouette rises out of the dust like a forgotten guardian whose story ends too soon. That is where the path leads next, into the realm of the giant short-faced kangaroo, a creature whose existence feels clear, but whose disappearance echoes with unanswered questions. There is a particular stillness that hangs over the story of Procoptodon, the giant short-faced kangaroo, as if the land itself remembers the weight of its presence, but refuses to offer more than a dim outline. Even its posture unsettles expectations. Unlike modern kangaroos whose movements are defined by bounding arcs and rhythmic hopping, Procoptodon seems to stand in defiance of its own lineage. Upright, towering, almost sentinel-like. Fossilized limb proportions suggest it walked in deliberate steps rather than hopped, its massive legs more suited to bearing weight than delivering elastic leaps. It is a creature that feels familiar and alien at once, an animal shaped by Australia, yet somehow out of place within its own evolutionary story. The skull is the first feature that breaks the illusion of familiarity. Short, deep, and robust, it gives the animal an unexpectedly imposing presence. Its jaw, fitted with large grinding teeth, hints at a diet of tough, fibrous vegetation. Leaves stripped from shrubs, desert plants resistant to drought, and perhaps bark scraped from young trees. But the true mystery lies in how such a creature moved through its world. Reconstructions propose a gait unlike any kangaroo alive today, a stiff-legged stride almost reminiscent of a giant bird or a slow-moving hominid. Some researchers argue it could not hop sustainably due to its size, over 500 kilograms in some estimates, and must have walked instead. Others believe it possessed a hybrid motion, capable of both hopping and striding depending on terrain. But the bones remain ambiguous, offering no definitive answer. The ambiguity extends beyond anatomy. Sites that preserve Procoptodon remains are unevenly distributed, some rich with bones, others barren where the species should have thrived. At Lake Calabana, entire skeletons lie where they fell, frozen in positions suggesting sudden entrapment in mud or marshland. Many individuals appear to have died together, as if drawn to shrinking water sources during drought. Their heavy bodies sank into soft ground, becoming entombed in sediments that hardened over tens of thousands of years. But while the lakebeds paint a scene of environmental stress, they do not explain the larger pattern of disappearance across the continent. The decline of Procoptodon, like that of so many Australian megafauna, aligns with the same narrow window of time, an interval that grows heavier with each part of this story. Climate change is often offered as the simplest explanation. Australia becoming more arid, vegetation shifting from lush shrubs to drought-resistant spinifex, waterholes drying, ecosystems tightening. And yet, Procoptodon had survived previous climatic shifts. Its robust form seems almost sculpted for hardship. Why then, in this particular span, did its resilience falter? Some point to fire stick farming, the controlled burns used by early humans to manage landscapes. This practice, though essential for shaping many Australian habitats, may have altered vegetation in ways that disadvantaged large specialized herbivores. If Procoptodon relied on shrubs that declined under frequent burning, its food sources may have dwindled faster than its ability to adapt. Yet this theory confronts the same problem as others: the lack of gradual change. The species does not taper off gently in the record. It drops away. The possibility of human hunting lingers over every species in this era. But here again, the evidence is elusive. There are no mass kill sites, no bones split by stone tools, no clear indications of butchering. Early humans would have encountered Procoptodon. Its towering height and imposing stance would have made it an unmistakable figure against the horizon. Yet the archaeological record is silent. The creature seems to vanish without struggle, without confrontation, without leaving the usual scars that mark a species heavily exploited by humans. There is a theory, whispered in academic corners, that Procoptodon's disappearance may reflect a broader ecological collapse triggered by the loss of other megafauna. If giant herbivores and predators vanished in a synchronized cascade, ecosystems could have shifted rapidly, each disappearance magnifying the vulnerability of the next. Perhaps the loss of Diprotodon altered vegetation patterns. Perhaps the decline of predators like Thylacoleo allowed herbivore numbers to spike temporarily, leading to overgrazing and further instability. But this too is conjecture woven around incomplete data. The timelines do not always align cleanly. Some species vanish earlier, others later. The pattern remains suggestive but not definitive. One returns, inevitably, to the fossil record's silence. As with Genyornis, as with Megalania, as with Thylacoleo, there is a threshold in time beyond which Procoptodon simply ceases to appear. Not shrinking in number layer by layer, but ending abruptly. A continental hush in which multiple species vanish together. Even the footprints, those rare, precious impressions pressed into ancient mud, show no transition. They mark the presence of a giant striding across plains, and then the ground carries no more of its weight. This abruptness raises questions about memory as well. Aboriginal oral traditions describe many animals from deep time: immense birds, monstrous reptiles, even creatures resembling Diprotodon. But references to kangaroos of extraordinary size are more diffuse. Some stories speak of giant hopping beings that shaped hills and valleys. Yet these tales often merge with broader cosmological narratives rather than refer to specific species. If Procoptodon coexisted with early humans, why do memories not reflect it more clearly? Did it linger only briefly after human arrival? Or did it disappear so suddenly that its presence never had the time to settle into cultural continuity? Even more peculiar is the lack of clear transitional habitats. The areas where Procoptodon should have retreated during ecological stress show no signs of late survival, no shrinking refuges, no dwindling populations tucked into favorable niches. It is as if the species did not decline. It stopped. The more this pattern repeats across species, the more it feels intentional. Not in a conscious sense, but in a structural one. Nature rarely synchronizes extinctions across unrelated clades without a clear driver: volcanism, meteor impact, widespread disease. But none of these agents leave signatures matching the timeline. What we see instead is something subtler: layers missing, sediments eroded precisely at the boundary of disappearance, gaps in the sequence like torn pages removed long ago. Standing in this growing emptiness, Procoptodon becomes more than a biological subject. It becomes a symbol of the land's forgotten giants, a reminder of the threshold beyond which visibility dissolves. And this threshold appears again and again, forming a boundary between the world that was and the silence that followed. As we walk further into the dust of this ancient continent, the next figure waiting in the shifting light is the marsupial lion, Thylacoleo carnifex. A predator so efficient, so specialized, and yet so poorly preserved in the fossil record that its absence feels almost orchestrated. Its claws continue to scratch across cave walls, but its story, like so many others, ends abruptly in the fog. The pattern deepens, the questions sharpen, and the continent grows quieter still. There is a tension in the air whenever the story turns toward Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, a creature whose existence feels at once undeniable and impossible. Its bones, though few, radiate a kind of precision that evolution rarely grants so cleanly. Each part of its body seems designed for a single purpose: to kill efficiently. Yet the land holds so few of these bones that one wonders whether the creature moved through ancient Australia like a shadow, touching the world without leaving it fully marked. And perhaps that is why its presence feels haunting, as though it hunted not only animals, but the very edges of memory. The skull is the first hint of its strangeness. Short, deep, and packed with jaws that anchored some of the most powerful bite forces of any mammal its size. The premolars, oddly shaped, blade-like, were capable of slicing through tendon and bone with a mechanical exactness. Unlike big cats, which rely on long canines, Thylacoleo wielded crushing blades. Its jaws did not simply bite, they sheared. And then the claws, retractable like a feline's, razor-sharp, anchored in robust limbs. It could climb, it could ambush, it could grapple prey with a grip unmatched by any living marsupial. With such specialization, one might expect a corresponding richness of fossils, a trail of victims marked by its teeth, a scattering of dens, a landscape imprinted with its predatory authority. But instead, the creature appears in faint flickers: a few skulls, partial skeletons, claw marks etched into the limestone walls of caves. In the famous Narakorte caves of South Australia, vertical scratches climb the stone, evidence of an animal dragging itself upward in complete darkness. The marks are too deep and too wide for any modern marsupial, too deliberate to be accidental. They suggest a predator comfortable in confined spaces, perhaps dragging prey into hidden chambers, perhaps raising young in the quiet safety of caves. Yet even here, in a place where predators should leave abundant remains, Thylacoleo leaves only presence without body. This absence grows more suspicious when compared to other species of similar size. Diprotodon skeletons survive in abundance. Kangaroo fossils dot the continent. Even the elusive Megalania leaves more scattered traces. But Thylacoleo, apex predator, dominant hunter, remains elusive. It is as though Australia, in its deep geological memory, chose not to preserve the full imprint of this creature. A strange choice, given how essential predators are to ecological narratives. It is here that one confronts a troubling pattern. The predators vanish as abruptly as the giants they hunted. Thylacoleo's disappearance aligns closely with the collapse of other megafauna around 40 to 45,000 years ago, a synchronization that amplifies the mystery. Climate may have stressed the herbivores, but a top-level carnivore adapted to ambush and versatility should have persisted longer, shifting diets or territories. Yet it does not. It fades in the same narrow window, as if responding not to scarcity, but to a larger disturbance, something that reshaped the entire ecological hierarchy in one sweeping gesture. Some researchers propose that human arrival played a role, not through hunting the predator, but through disrupting prey populations. Others suggest fire-based landscape management altered the habitats Thylacoleo depended on. But these explanations feel incomplete. They assume a slow unraveling, a gradual waning. Yet the fossil record does not show gradual change. It shows termination, a boundary line beyond which the marsupial lion simply does not step. The uncertainty deepens when considering Aboriginal oral traditions. Many stories speak of giant creatures, monstrous beings that lurked in forests or haunted waterholes. Some describe clawed hunters with deadly strength, but none map cleanly onto Thylacoleo. If early humans encountered such a creature, a predator deadlier than any stalking the land today, would memory not have etched it more vividly into myth? Or did they encounter it only briefly, only at the edges of their settlement, only in moments too few or too fleeting for a narrative to form? Yet the presence of claw marks in caves suggests Thylacoleo lived long enough to intersect with human arrival. The marks do not predate humans by much, nor do they clearly overlap. They sit at the threshold, just close enough to hint at coexistence, just distant enough to avoid confirmation. The fossil record, as always, withholds more than it reveals. Even the ecological reconstructions are tinged with contradiction. Some studies argue that Thylacoleo hunted large prey, Diprotodon, giant kangaroos, perhaps even juvenile Megalania. Others argue it preyed mostly on medium-sized animals. Still others propose it was a scavenger, although its formidable claws and teeth argue strongly against this. The absence of direct kill sites allows all these hypotheses to linger, none fully proven. It is a predator whose story we can sense but not fully articulate. And again, there is the troubling issue of habitat. Where did Thylacoleo live during ecological stress? Where are the refuges it should have retreated to? Other species show these patterns. Declining populations tucked into shrinking pockets of survival. But Thylacoleo leaves no such narrowing trail. It is as if, once the threshold approached, the species stepped into the fog and vanished. No weakened populations, no transitional forms, only absence. One begins to wonder whether the disappearance of Thylacoleo reflects not the end of a species, but the end of visibility itself, an erosion of evidence rather than an erosion of life. So many of Australia's megafauna vanish at this same horizon. So many leave disproportionately sparse remains. So many break from the expected rhythms of extinction. The marsupial lion fits too neatly into this pattern to dismiss as coincidence. The more carefully one studies its remains, the more they resemble artifacts of a missing story. The claw marks on cave walls resemble notes scrawled in the margins of a book whose pages have been torn out. The bones feel like punctuation left behind after the sentences have been erased. The species is present, yet strangely unanchored. Confirmed, yet underdescribed. Its absence is not just biological, it is narrative. And standing at this point in the story, the silence becomes heavier. For every giant predator removed from the land, a new ecological vacuum opened. And into that vacuum stepped creatures that thrived not through strength, but through adaptation to a drying, shifting continent. Yet even these adapted forms, those that should have resisted change, did not endure. As the story deepens, the next shadow rising from the continent's forgotten plains is Quinkana, the land crocodile, a creature that challenges our assumptions about what crocodiles are and how they once moved across this ancient world. With long limbs built not for swimming but for pursuit, it hunted on dry earth with a precision that modern crocodiles would not recognize. And like Thylacoleo, it too fades into the continent's quiet at the same unsettling threshold. The pattern repeats. The silence grows, and the questions do not weaken. They sharpen, waiting for whoever dares look into the next layer of the fog. There is something uniquely disquieting about confronting the story of Quinkana, the land crocodile. A creature that unsettles not because of what we know, but because of what should be known yet isn't. Modern crocodiles evoke images of still water, slow drifting bodies, and sudden ambushes from beneath the surface. But Quinkana belonged to no such world. It moved on land, not water. It ran rather than lurked. Its legs were long, positioned beneath its body like those of a wolf or big cat, lifting it high enough that it could hunt across dry forests and open scrub without dragging its belly across the earth. It was not an ambusher of riverbanks. It was a walker of shadows, a terrestrial predator built for motion, not patience. In a sense, Quinkana feels like a missing chapter in crocodilian evolution, a branch that grew in an unexpected direction before vanishing completely. And as with so many of the giants of prehistoric Australia, what remains of it is frustratingly incomplete. Bones scattered across Queensland and the Northern Territory tell us it existed for millions of years, persisting deep into the Pleistocene. Its jaws suggest a slicing predator capable of attacking large animals. Its teeth, unlike the conical gripping teeth of modern crocs, were laterally compressed and serrated, built to tear. This was not merely a crocodile on legs. It was a distinct kind of carnivore, adapted to a world where speed and agility mattered. Yet for all its long history, Quinkana leaves behind almost no clear narrative. There are teeth, jaw fragments, scattered vertebrae, enough to confirm its form, not enough to reconstruct its life fully. No complete skeleton, no well-preserved den sites, no trackways that map the rhythm of its gait across ancient mud, no kill sites where its bite marks tell the story of prey subdued. For an apex predator living on land, with a body large enough to challenge early humans and a presence lasting millions of years, the absence is startling. The fossil record feels stripped of context, as if someone erased everything except the outline. And again, there is the curious matter of timing. Quinkana's disappearance aligns with the same critical interval in which so many giant Australian animals vanish. A gradual decline would produce decreasing fossil density across multiple layers. Instead, its presence simply halts. It is here in late Pleistocene sediments, and then it isn't. No transitional forms, no smaller descendants lingering in isolated refuges, no adaptation to changing climate. The species did not shrink or shift its niche. It ended. Climate explanations have been offered, particularly the intensification of aridity across Australia during the late Pleistocene. Water sources shrank. Forests thinned. The land hardened. But Quinkana thrived in environments far cooler and wetter than today's deserts, and its long terrestrial lineage suggests resilience. Environmental stress alone rarely eliminates a predator lineage so abruptly. Moreover, if aridity were the sole cause, one might expect the species to retreat toward river systems or coastal zones, gradually contracting its range. Yet no such refuges show late fossils. Quinkana does not retreat. It vanishes. Some propose human competition. Perhaps early Aboriginal hunters altered prey availability or modified landscapes with fire. But Quinkana had existed for millions of years alongside shifting ecosystems. Its lineage survived earlier climatic swings, fluctuating environments, and droughts far more intense than the period surrounding its extinction. For human activity to be the cause, the impact would need to be severe and immediate. Yet the archaeological record reveals no direct interactions. No stories describe a land crocodile stalking forests. No engravings depict long-limbed reptilian hunters. No butchering sites include its bones. If humans encountered it, the encounter seems strangely unrecorded. This absence echoes through academic discussions, haunting like an unanswered question. Here was a predator as tall as a person at the shoulder, capable of outrunning most large animals, armed with jaws built to tear flesh. And yet there is no trace of its clash with humans. No signs of avoidance in settlement patterns. No shifts in tool design. Nothing to suggest fear, adaptation, or mythic memory. It is as though the species' final centuries passed unnoticed or unshared. But perhaps the silence is itself a clue. Perhaps Quinkana's decline mirrored the collapse of the giant herbivores it hunted. Kangaroos tall as trees, wombats the size of rhinos, birds half a ton in weight. If the continent lost its giants, how could its giant predator survive? Yet this line of thought leads into deeper uncertainty. Why did all these species decline so quickly? Why across such a synchronized time frame? Why with such incomplete fossil sequences? And why do the layers from roughly 40 to 45,000 years ago, across multiple regions, appear disturbed, eroded, or absent? The pattern becomes too large to ignore. Megalania, fragmented. Thylacoleo, fragmentary. Genyornis, suddenly absent. Procoptodon, abruptly gone. Diprotodon, mass deaths, but unclear decline. Quinkana, disappearing in the same temporal fog. It is as if the continent reached a threshold after which giants could no longer persist, or no longer be recorded. And that raises the question no one wants to ask directly. Is the mystery rooted in extinction, or in the loss of evidence? This continent is old beyond comprehension. Erosion strips away layers. Floodplains bury fossils deep beneath shifting sediments. Fire cycles reset entire landscapes. But these processes are not new. Australia endured millions of years of such cycles while preserving ample fossils from earlier epochs. So why does this particular era, this window before human history becomes visible, bear the marks not of gradual change, but of disappearance? One cannot help but sense that something happened here, something subtle enough to leave no single catastrophic scar, yet profound enough to rearrange ecosystems, erase evidence, and rewrite the living map of the land. Something that brushed through predator and prey alike, leaving their stories half told. Quinkana becomes, in this light, more than a reptile. It becomes another expression of the silence that has followed us through these parts. A silence that does not defend itself, does not offer explanation, but instead forms a widening boundary in the fossil record. Behind that boundary lie shadows of a world we cannot fully reconstruct. Before it lies the world we know. The more one stares at Quinkana's scattered bones, the more they resemble punctuation marks in a sentence whose beginning is lost. And just beyond that punctuation waits another giant, one even more enigmatic. A creature whose upright posture and unsettling gait challenge our assumptions of marsupial evolution. A herbivore as tall as a man, with a face strangely flat, as though shaped for a world now gone. As the land crocodile fades into the quiet, a new silhouette emerges in the dust. The giant short-faced kangaroo, Procoptodon's peculiar cousin, another being erased at the threshold. And with each step deeper into the fog, the pattern sharpens while the cause retreats, leaving us to follow the shadows into the next fragment of Australia's lost world. There is a strange weight that settles over the imagination when one lingers on the image of Thylacoleo for too long. But an even deeper unease emerges when the mind shifts toward the creature waiting in the next fold of Australia's forgotten past. The marsupial lion's counterpart not in predation, but in disappearance. The giant short-faced kangaroo's own shadow, the upright sentinel of the continent. Yet even this creature, with all its oddities, cannot fully prepare the listener for the next figure in the story. Because as soon as the herbivores fade and the terrestrial crocodiles grow quiet, and the giant birds leave only eggshell ghosts behind, something else begins to take shape in the periphery, a presence sharper, more ancient, and infinitely more disturbing. That presence is the marsupial lion's mirror in ferocity. Not Thylacoleo itself, but the implication it leaves in its wake. For when all these giants vanish, their absence clears the silence for a single solitary question. What removed the continent's largest predators so completely that even their legacy feels incomplete? And this question becomes unavoidable when one turns to the next creature in the sequence. The long-armed hunter, the massive tree climber, the silent ambusher whose claws still score cave walls and jagged lines. Thylacoleo carnifex. Except now, the perspective shifts. Because while earlier we explored the predator itself, here in Part 7, we step deeper, beyond the animal's biology and into the shadow of its disappearance, into the places where its ghost lingers not in bones, but in the unsettling consequences of its absence. The story of Thylacoleo's final centuries appears as a puzzle with pieces missing, because the marsupial lion should have endured. Every biological indicator suggests resilience, stealth, power, adaptability, the ability to climb, ambush, and strike with precision. And yet when the ecological world around it began to fracture, it did not shift its diet, did not shrink its territory, did not survive in isolated refuges as so many smaller carnivores did. It simply receded into silence, like a candle snuffed in a room too large for anyone to notice. But if the creature itself has vanished, the marks it left behind have not. Those cave scratches, deep and carved with purpose, remain one of the continent's most haunting signatures. Some of these vertical gouges run meters high, suggesting the animal reared up, bracing its muscular body against stone as it climbed into dark chambers. Others form intertwined paths, implying repeated use, perhaps for denning, or feeding, or simply escaping daylight heat. But even these marks refuse to follow a logical timeline. Many appear in layers too recent for a creature supposedly extinct. Others align with sediments whose dating remains contested, as if the chronology itself is slipping through cracks. And so arises a dilemma. Either the creature survived later than we believe, or the chronology of the caves contains gaps we do not yet understand. Both possibilities press deeper into the fog that surrounds Australia's prehistoric transitions. The more one pulls at these threads, the more they weave themselves into a tapestry of absence rather than explanation. Then there is the issue of prey. If Thylacoleo was the continent's apex predator, what happened when its primary prey, Diprotodon, Procoptodon, and other massive herbivores, began to disappear? Apex predators usually show adaptability. They shift towards smaller prey. They migrate. They innovate. Yet the marsupial lion shows no such behavior. Its fossil presence does not taper as prey declines. Instead, both predator and prey collapse together, as though tied by an invisible cord. A simultaneous vanishing act. A synchrony that feels too neat to be an accident. And yet, one must ask, why would nature orchestrate such precision? Why would unrelated lineages, a lion-like marsupial, giant kangaroos, massive wombats, towering birds, long-legged crocodiles, giant reptiles, all pass through the same exit point in time? The marsupial lion's disappearance is not an isolated riddle. It is part of a motif, a series of vanishings that follow identical patterns without identical causes. Could it have been disease? A pathogen that moved through large-bodied animals but spared the smaller ones? Possibly. Yet no traces of such a pathogen remain, and disease rarely touches predators and prey with equal force. Could it have been sudden ecosystem collapse? But where is the evidence for an abrupt climatic rupture? The aridification of Australia was gradual, not immediate, not cataclysmic. Could humans have caused this? Through hunting or burning or indirect pressures? Perhaps. But again, the timeline resists simplicity. Human presence overlaps unevenly with these extinctions, and the archaeological record provides little evidence of direct conflict between humans and Thylacoleo. What if the rupture is not ecological at all, but temporal? What if it stems from the missing sediments, the disturbed layers, the eroded horizons that appear across the continent exactly where the megafauna vanish? This possibility lingers quietly in academic circles, not as mysticism, but as a recognition that the geological record may not be complete. Not all disappearance is biological. Some disappearance is archival. But in the whispering dark of these questions sits the most troubling realization of all. If Thylacoleo vanished in a synchronized collapse of giants, then perhaps it is not the only predator whose disappearance signifies something deeper. Because predators do not fall first, they fall last. And in the silence left behind by Thylacoleo's absence, early humans would have encountered a continent suddenly emptied of its largest threats. A land where apex predators had vanished without struggle, leaving ecological niches unoccupied, food webs unbalanced, and memories unanchored. What effect would such a sudden emptiness have had on the earliest peoples? What stories might have emerged? Stories not of confrontation, but of absence. Some Aboriginal narratives speak of fearsome creatures that once hunted the land. But these stories hint at presences fading into the distance, not at active confrontation. It is as though the memory of the predator never fully settled, as though humans arrived just in time to sense the shadow of something already leaving. And this brings us to the quiet implication beneath everything so far, that the predators did not just disappear from the land. They disappeared from memory, from sediment, from narrative, from continuity itself. And yet, if the predators vanished, what doors did their absence open? What creatures moved into the spaces they left behind? What forces shaped a continent stripped suddenly of its most dangerous hunters? To answer this, we must look not toward the predators, but toward the land itself, toward the continent's slow drying, its shrinking lakes, its shifting vegetation, the environmental canvas upon which these disappearances unfolded. The next part of this journey steps deeper into those changes, into the slow unraveling of Australia's climate, and into the possibility that the silence surrounding the giants may not come from their demise alone, but from something in the land itself reshaping what could survive. And in that shifting land, the next truth waits. Quiet, patient, and unfinished. There is a moment when tracing the final centuries of Australia's megafauna, where the animals themselves seem to fade into the background and something larger takes center stage. Not a creature, not a predator, but the land itself. A vast, ancient continent shifting under forces so slow they normally escape notice. Yet here, in this particular corridor of time, the changes feel strangely synchronized with the disappearance of giants. The story of extinction is often told through bones, claws, and teeth. But in Australia, it begins increasingly to feel like a story written in water. The slow draining of lakes, the retreat of forests, the hardening of the soil beneath a sun that seemed to grow more insistent with each passing millennium. What unsettles researchers is not that Australia became drier. This is a continent long shaped by droughts and cycles of scarcity. What unsettles them is the peculiar tempo of the shift. In the long, quiet stretch leading into the late Pleistocene, environments transformed in ways that were uneven, patchy, and regionally distinct. Some areas grew arid while others remained lush. Wetlands contracted but did not vanish. Forests thinned but still offered sanctuary. And yet the extinctions behave as though a single sweeping force passed across the land. Too coordinated, too simultaneous. To understand this strange convergence, one must step into the landscapes that existed between 40 and 50,000 years ago. Imagine vast inland lakes shimmering under hot skies. Lake Eyre, Lake Frome, Lake Calibana, all interconnected through systems that pulsed with water in earlier epochs. These lakes were once deep basins, drawing giant herbivores to their shores. But in the late Pleistocene, they began to dry in irregular rhythms, filling partially, then emptying entirely, then filling again. The record shows oscillations, not a steady march into desiccation, but fluctuations like breaths drawn in and let out by the land. Yet despite these fluctuations, the life around these lakes collapsed in a way that does not align neatly with the drying curve. Diprotodon, Procoptodon, and other giants had weathered earlier, harsher cycles. So why did these particular changes prove fatal? Was the moisture loss alone responsible? Or did the drying merely expose cracks in an ecological system already weakened by something else? Something the sediment cannot fully record. Further inland, the forests of eastern Australia reveal another contradiction. Pollen records extracted from ancient soils show gradual long-term shifts from wet-adapted species to drought-resistant shrubs and grasses. But the transition occurs at a pace that does not match the sudden disappearance of browsing megafauna. Even as forests thinned, they remained capable of supporting large herbivores. The vegetation itself does not tell the story of a continent suddenly inhospitable. Instead, it whispers of slow change, steady adjustments, adaptive shifts, none of which explain the abruptness of extinction. Then there are the fire signatures, charcoal layers embedded in sediment cores across the continent. Some researchers interpret these layers as evidence of increased burning, possibly linked to early humans practicing fire stick management. And indeed, controlled burning may have altered ecosystems in subtle ways, favoring fire-resistant species and reshaping habitats. But here again, the evidence refuses simplicity. Charcoal levels rise in some regions, but decrease in others. Fire alone cannot produce synchronized disappearance across such varied landscapes. What emerges instead is a troubling sense of incompleteness. The environmental record from this time is marked by gaps, literal absences in sedimentary layers across multiple sites. Lakebeds that should preserve continuous histories instead contain interruptions. Cave floors show missing layers. River terraces carry scars of erosion not fully aligned with known climatic events. These gaps fall eerily close to the extinction window. It is as though the land's memory itself faltered, and this leads into the whispers circulating quietly among paleoecologists, not of catastrophes, but of discontinuities. The idea that not all change leaves a trace, that some transitions in Earth's history may occur through processes not fully captured by the sediment. What if the drying was only part of the story? What if the land did not merely lose water, but restructured itself in ways faster, more uneven, or more sweeping than the visible record suggests? Even the creatures that survived, kangaroos, emus, wallabies, smaller marsupials, show shifts in distribution patterns so abrupt they appear as ecological jump cuts. Species retreat to new refuges not gradually, but suddenly, as though pushed by an unseen hand. Population models reveal bottlenecks during this period, sharp contractions in genetic diversity that do not match the slow, steady forces of climate alone. The more one studies these changes, the more they resemble an ecological reset rather than a decline. Not destruction, but rearrangement. A reshuffling of what could persist, what had to vanish, and what would evolve into forms recognizable today. Australia emerges from this period not simply altered, but rewritten, and within this rewriting lies a deeper ache. The silence of what is missing. The giants that dominated the land for millions of years, perfectly adapted to environments that sustained them through countless cycles, vanish not at the coldest point, not at the driest, but at the moment when the record itself looks most incomplete. It is a coincidence too heavy to ignore. Aboriginal oral traditions, which preserve some of the oldest continuous memories on Earth, speak of landscapes transformed by forces both natural and ancestral. Some stories recount the drying of lakes, the shrinking of forests, the shifting of rivers. Others describe beings that shaped watercourses, opened valleys, or commanded the movement of storms. These stories, though spiritual, often align with geological truths. Yet even these oral memories dim around the same threshold. They speak of giants, but vaguely. They speak of changes, but softly. They leave space, a silence that mirrors the sedimentary gaps. And perhaps this is the heart of the mystery. The land's drying did not erase life alone. It erased memory. It erased continuity. Something happened during this ancient interval that touched not just animals and landscapes, but the very record of existence. As this period unfolds, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a transformation whose cause remains unfinished, whose signs remain partial, and whose effects ripple through every species that lived and died in its wake. And from this edge, the story moves into the arrival of humans, not as destroyers, but as witnesses. Witnesses to change they did not fully create and could not fully understand. The next chapter of this journey steps into that intersection, where human footprints meet those of giants, where shadows overlap, where presence and absence blur. And in that meeting, the questions deepen just as the trail becomes faint. There is a certain hush that falls whenever the conversation turns toward the earliest humans in Australia. Not the people themselves, but the way their presence intersects with the fading footprints of the giants. It is a hush made not of reverence, but of uncertainty. Because the moment humans enter the story, the record, already faint and fractured, becomes even harder to follow. Dates shift, layers disagree, artifacts surface without context, footprints appear where they should not, and disappear where they should endure. And as these threads intertwine with the trails of megafauna, the timelines begin to blur in a way that feels almost intentional, as though the continent is reluctant to reveal what truly happened when human footsteps met the last shadows of the giant beasts. The oldest sites, Majid Bebe in the Northern Territory, the dunes of Lake Mungo, the riverbanks of the Willandra Lakes, tell of human presence stretching back more than 60,000 years. Stone tools, pigments, hearths, fragments of meals consumed by campfires long extinguished. These traces provoke awe, but they also provoke confusion. Some layers appear older than their surroundings. Others seem redeposited, disturbed by floods or winds or ancient movements of sand. Even experts disagree. Did humans arrive earlier than expected? Did they coexist with creatures like Thylacoleo and Procoptodon for thousands of years? Or did their timelines merely overlap at the edges, like two shadows meeting briefly before drifting apart? The dating methods offer competing narratives. Radiocarbon ages challenge luminescence measurements. Sediment cores contradict erosion lines. And beneath these disagreements lies a deeper tension. The question of how long humans lived alongside the giants and whether they played any role, direct or indirect, in their disappearance. There are signs that humans encountered megafauna, but the signs are slippery. Burned Genyornis eggshells, scattered across the continent, speak of early interactions with giant birds. Tools found near megafauna bones hint at proximity, but not necessarily hunting. Some Diprotodon bones show marks that could be from stone implements, or from trampling, erosion, or scavengers. The ambiguity is relentless. Each piece of evidence opens as many possibilities as it closes. Even the footprints, those rare, delicate imprints captured in ancient mud, carry contradictions. In some sites, human tracks and those of giant kangaroos appear in the same layers. In others, they are separated by intervals that seem too small to matter, yet too large to confirm direct interaction. And at a few locations, there are enigmatic trackways where large and small feet move together across a drying lakebed, the spacing and depth suggesting simultaneous movement. But the sediment has shifted over tens of thousands of years, warping what might have been a moment of shared presence into an echo impossible to interpret with certainty. This uncertainty expands into cultural memory as well. Aboriginal oral traditions are among the oldest living histories on Earth, preserving accounts of geological events tens of thousands of years old, volcanic eruptions, rising seas, climate shifts. If any human culture could have preserved stories of the giants, it would be these. And indeed, there are stories. Tales of enormous kangaroos, monstrous serpents, giant birds that thundered across plains. But these stories are wrapped in symbolism, layered with cosmology, filtered through spiritual meaning. Some may preserve echoes of real encounters with megafauna, others may not. And the challenge lies in knowing which is which. Yet, even with these uncertainties, one thing becomes clear. The arrival of humans did not immediately disrupt the continent. There is no sudden drop in megafauna remains at the exact moment humans appear. No smoking gun of mass hunting. No evidence of overkill, as has been proposed for other continents. If humans contributed to the giants' decline, it was not through a single catastrophic action, but through something quieter, more diffuse, perhaps shifting fire regimes, or competition for water sources, or changes in plant communities. But even these possibilities falter beneath the weight of the fossil record's silence, because the more carefully one examines the evidence, the more one realizes that the greatest problem is not human impact. It is the gaps themselves. Entire stretches of time lack clear sedimentary layering. Bones appear out of sequence. Artifacts migrate upward or downward through disturbed soils. And across multiple sites, the layers corresponding to the extinction window appear thinner, more eroded, more incomplete than the layers above and below. As if something passed through the continent, not erasing life directly, but erasing the evidence of its passing. Even the genetic record speaks in half-sentences. Analyses of human DNA suggest a long period of population stability, with no signatures of massive demographic upheaval corresponding to the extinction event. This means humans did not spread rapidly in a way that would have displaced wildlife. Yet megafauna disappear anyway. How can one reconcile a stable human presence with an unstable ecological collapse? And then comes the most haunting possibility, that humans witnessed the decline, but not the cause. That they lived through a period of quiet environmental restructuring, a shift in rainfall patterns, a change in fire cycles, a reorganization of plant communities, which, while survivable for humans, became catastrophic for large-bodied species. And because humans survived, their stories fragment around what they could not fully understand. They saw the giants fade. They did not see the force that faded them. This interpretation is subtle, but it carries weight. It suggests that the giants did not fall because of humans, but that both giants and humans adapted to a world undergoing a transformation whose fingerprints remain incomplete in the sediment. A transformation too slow to be called a catastrophe, too fast to be called gradual, too pervasive to be localized, too inconsistent to leave a clean geological signature. Perhaps a convergence of stressors: climate, fire, water, vegetation, compounded in a way that became unendurable for megafauna. But even this theory does not fully soothe the discomfort. Because if such a transformation occurred, one would expect uneven effects across species. Yet the extinctions cluster unnervingly close together. And the more closely one looks at the timing, the more the question reemerges. Why does the extinction window align so precisely with the missing layers? This is the threshold on which the story now stands. A meeting point of human arrival, ecological change, and vanished evidence. And from this threshold, the path ahead leads not further into biology or archaeology, but into the silence itself. The unseen, unrecorded intervals where history ceases to be a story of life and becomes a story of what remains after life is gone. The next part steps into that silence more directly, into the archaeology of absence, the layers that should exist but don't, the sediments that break off abruptly, the record that behaves less like a linear history and more like a page torn from a book. And in that missing page, the questions multiply. There comes a point in this long descent through Australia's forgotten past, where the story no longer feels guided by the creatures who lived here. Instead, the land itself becomes the narrator, though not through what it reveals, but through what it withholds. By the time one reaches the 10th layer of this journey, the fossils feel less like relics and more like punctuation marks bracketing long intervals of silence. And these silences, strangely consistent across vast regions, begin to feel like the true mystery. The archaeology of absence, the geology of lost pages, the unsettling realization that the continent's most important story might lie not in what exists, but in what is missing. Every extinction leaves a trace. Bones accumulate, sediments entomb them. Time presses them into layers that scientists read like pages in a chronicle. But here in Australia, something interrupts the narrative, not a catastrophe in the traditional sense, not a volcanic ashfall or an asteroid impact or a sudden flood, but something more ambiguous, something that behaves not like destruction, but like erasure. A quiet, selective erosion that leaves behind fragments where entire chapters should be. Geologists studying lake basins such as Lake Eyre and Lake Calabana often encounter stratigraphic anomalies, layers that thin abruptly, lenses of sediment that taper where they should continue, entire sections missing from sequences that otherwise run smoothly through time. In some places, deep layers representing tens of thousands of years are intact, followed by an unexpected break just before the megafauna disappear. The missing intervals vary in size, but align closely around the same millennial window. This pattern repeats in caves, river terraces, dune systems, even in rock shelters. At first glance, one might attribute these gaps to natural processes: wind erosion, shifting sands, the movement of water across ancient floodplains. But erosion does not coordinate itself across a continent. It does not strip layers simultaneously in the same chronological band across thousands of kilometers. Local events do not produce continent-wide absences unless shaped by a larger pattern, one that remains invisible in the geological record. What makes these missing layers even more troubling is their content, what they should contain, but do not. The last bones of Diprotodon, the final traces of Procoptodon, the late marks of Megalania's presence, the dwindling prints of Genyornis, the dens where Thylacoleo might have passed its final generations, the marks of Quinkana's last hunts. All these should appear in the transitional sediments leading toward extinction. Yet in many regions, those sediments are barely there. A page torn from the book, a sentence left incomplete. This is why some archaeologists refer to this period as the archaeology of absence. It is not simply that evidence is lost. It is that the precise evidence needed to resolve the mystery is the evidence missing. One begins to sense a pattern. The closer researchers move toward the extinction horizon, the fewer data remain. Radiocarbon dates cluster poorly. Fossils fragment. Artifacts lose context. Layers blur, fall apart, or vanish entirely. Even the caves, which often preserve the richest histories of ancient life, suffer from this silence. In several limestone systems, the sediments accumulate steadily for tens of thousands of years, then thin out or crumble around the same period the giants disappear. Burrowing animals disturb layers. Water infiltration washes away fine material. Yet these processes, too, do not fully explain the synchronicity. Why should cave systems scattered across the continent show parallel disruptions? Some scientists argue that environmental instability, fluctuating water tables, shifting vegetation, unpredictable rainfall, may have caused these inconsistent deposition patterns. Others propose increased fire activity, altering surface conditions enough to destroy or shift sediments before they were preserved. And perhaps these explanations carry part of the truth, but even they cannot address the deeper issue. The missing layers are too specifically timed, too concentrated around the period when megafauna vanish with uncanny uniformity. This leads to a more philosophical question, one rarely spoken aloud in academic contexts, yet impossible to ignore when staring at the gaps. What if the record we are trying to interpret does not represent the full story? What if extinction did not occur exactly where the evidence suggests, but only appears to because evidence before and after is preserved unevenly? What if the animals persisted longer or disappeared earlier, but the geological record compresses their histories into the illusion of simultaneity? And if that is true, what forced such compression? There is a hypothesis, whispered rather than published, that Australia's extinction event may not have been a single moment at all, but a long, quiet erosion stretched across millennia. An erosion of environments, yes, but also an erosion of memory. Not only geological memory, but human memory as well. Because as the archaeological layers thin, so too do the oral traditions. Stories that once spoke of giants become hazier, more symbolic, less tied to physical forms. It is as if both earth and mind experience the same forgetting. Still, another perspective suggests itself when looking at the broader picture. Across the globe, extinction waves tend to leave thick fossil beds, not thin ones. The death of giants usually produces accumulations, mass graves, bone beds, transitional deposits that document decline. But Australia offers the opposite. Decline without accumulation, disappearance without residue. Some consider the possibility of disease, but diseases do not erase sediments. Some consider fire, but fire does not produce coordinated geological gaps. Some consider human activity, but humans do not unwrite geological time. The missing layers are something different, less dramatic, more pervasive, occurring quietly across an entire continent, as if time itself brushed lightly across the surface and lifted away a chapter. This sense of erasure intensifies when comparing regions. The Kimberley, Arnhem Land, the Nullarbor, southeastern cave systems, southwestern wetlands, central desert basins, all show inconsistencies, discontinuities, or abrupt shifts during the same enigmatic period. It is as though Australia's prehistory is a tapestry fraying at its most crucial edge. Yet even frayed, the tapestry offers hints. A few late Diprotodon bones, a stray megafaunal tooth in a higher-than-expected layer, a set of footprints whose dating remains disputed. These anomalies suggest the giants may have persisted longer than the extinct horizon implies. But anomalies are fragile. They depend on context, and context here dissolves. One could argue that the land itself was changing in ways that destabilized preservation conditions. Fluctuating lakes, shifting sands, intense aridity cycles. But even these forces cannot fully explain the cross-continental nature of the gaps. Something shaped the land during this period. Something subtle, something widespread, something that left no catastrophic signature but rearranged the continent's ability to remember. This is the archaeology of absence, a place where evidence fades just as the story becomes urgent, where the land offers whispers instead of explanations, where sediment behaves mysteriously at the very threshold that could reveal what truly happened. And so, with the physical record thinning, the next place to look is not the earth, but the memory carried by people. Not artifacts, but stories. Not bones, but the echoes of knowledge preserved in oral traditions older than written history itself. And in those stories, the giants still breathe. Not clearly, not fully, but in fragments that might illuminate what the land has forgotten. Long before scientists began sifting through fossils and sediments, long before dates were assigned to layers of earth or species were reconstructed from scattered bones, the people of Australia carried their own records, not written, not drawn, but spoken and sung. These stories, passed from generation to generation across an unbroken chain stretching tens of thousands of years, are among the oldest continuous memories on Earth. And yet, when one listens closely to them, something uncanny emerges. Faint hints of a world filled with giants, woven into narratives that predate the arrival of written history by unimaginable spans of time. But like the fossil record, these memories, too, begin to blur and fade around the extinction horizon, mirroring the land's silence with a silence of their own. This parallel is striking. How can stories that encode details about ancient coastlines now underwater, stories proven accurate through modern geology, how can such stories speak clearly about events from more than 10,000 years ago, yet grow vague precisely at the period when the megafauna disappear? The Dreamtime narratives are rich with beings of extraordinary size: colossal kangaroos, monstrous birds, the rainbow serpent whose immense body carved rivers and valleys. Some describe creatures with razor claws, others with thunderous footsteps, others still with bodies so vast that the land trembled beneath them. To hear these tales through a modern scientific lens is to tread carefully. They are not zoological catalogs. They are spiritual, cosmological, symbolic. And yet some details align with extinct animals in ways too specific to ignore. The rainbow serpent, for instance, evokes a creature enormous and serpentine, perhaps a memory of giant pythons. The thunderbirds in some regions mirror descriptions of Genyornis. Stories of giant kangaroos resemble Procoptodon. But these alignments are soft, not literal. They are the echoes of something older, reshaped by meaning. And here, the enigma deepens. Because some stories appear to preserve memories of events far older than the extinction horizon. Volcanic eruptions, coastline shifts, meteor impacts. Yet the stories about giants exist in a different register. They feel scattered, half-remembered, blurred into myth. One wonders, did the creatures vanish before their presence could settle fully into cultural consciousness? Or did they vanish so quickly, so quietly, that the memories became more symbolic than historical, more archetype than eyewitness account? What complicates this question further is the vastness of Australia's oral landscape. Different regions preserve different threads. In the Kimberley, some narratives describe enormous beings that once roamed the savannas, leaving behind footprints too large for modern animals. In Arnhem Land, stories speak of great hunters that stalked the forests, felled by ancestral beings in battles etched into the sky. Along the Murray River, tales mention birds whose wings could darken the sun. All suggest a world once populated by giants. Yet none describe their disappearance in concrete terms. This absence of an ending mirrors the fossil record. Just as bones fail to show a gradual decline, stories fail to preserve a precise moment of departure. The giants are present, and then they are mythic. Present, and then they belong to a world before, a world reshaped by forces beyond human control. It is as if both geology and memory encountered the same threshold, the same quiet dissolution. There are exceptions, of course. Some traditions speak of great hunts, of battles between ancestral beings and monstrous animals, of creatures driven away or transformed. But these stories rarely align with megafaunal biology or ecology. Instead, they reflect deeper metaphors, landscapes changing shape, peoples adapting to new environments, the spiritual imprint of transformation. And yet the metaphor itself may encode remembrance. A continent losing its giants would feel like the world itself shifting. Memory might capture that shift not as an extinction event, but as a story of power passing from one kind of being to another. Anthropologists who study these narratives have long noted their temporal elasticity. Some stories stretch back tens of thousands of years with remarkable clarity. Others condense vast spans of time into a single arc. And some, especially those dealing with creatures that no longer exist, seem to drift across millennia, detached from fixed chronology. One theory suggests that stories about megafauna became unmoored once the creatures vanished. No longer reinforced by living memory, the narratives evolved into mythic form, their literal content fading, their symbolic weight growing. Yet this theory raises an unsettling question. How could animals so large, so imposing, so dominant leave so faint an imprint on human memory? How could their disappearance remain unspoken, unanchored, unexplained? Another possibility is that humans and megafauna did not interact long enough for detailed memories to take root. If the giants were already declining by the time humans spread widely across the continent, the encounters may have been sporadic and regionally isolated. Such fleeting interactions might imprint as awe rather than familiarity, as myth rather than history. But the deepest possibility is the one that aligns most closely with the archaeological gaps, that something occurred during the extinction period, not catastrophic, not singular, but transformative in a way that reshaped both the land and its memory. A long environmental transition, uneven and patchy, might disrupt not only ecosystems, but the continuity of cultural transmission. If people migrated, adapted, or reorganized their movement patterns in response to shifting landscapes, stories tied to older environments might have loosened. Memories of giants may have become echoes in a world whose shape no longer matched the story's original settings. Still, even in their faded form, the stories offer hints, small fragments that may illuminate what the land has forgotten. Some mention creatures withdrawing into caves or sinking into marshes. Others speak of beings that once walked the land but retreated when the world changed. A few tell of animals so enormous that when they died, the earth swallowed them. These motifs resonate faintly with the fossil record. Bone beds in lake muds, cavities in caves. The sudden absence of surface remains. Yet none of these stories point clearly to a cause. They offer wonder, not explanation. And that, too, mirrors the scientific dilemma. For every clue, another vanishes. For every insight, a new gap emerges. Whether in stone or in song, the record behaves in the same way. Complete until the moment it matters most, then abruptly incomplete. At this point in the journey, the giants have grown dim. Their predators have vanished. Their habitats have transformed. Their stories have blurred. And we are left not with evidence, but with silence. Thick, persistent, and strangely ordered. The only path forward now is to explore that silence more directly. The final phase of extinction, where multiple species collapse together in a synchrony that no single cause can fully explain, and yet which cannot be dismissed as coincidence. In that convergence, perhaps something waits, some insight not in the creatures themselves, but in the way they vanished, and in the shape of the quiet that followed. By the time the story reaches its 12th layer, the giants have already receded into silhouettes, half-formed in bone, thin in sediment, blurred in memory. And yet here, in this final corridor before the end, something shifts. The narrative tightens. The fading of each species, Diprotodon, Procoptodon, Genyornis, Megalania, Quinkana, Thylacoleo, no longer feels like an isolated event, but part of a single, synchronized unraveling, as though invisible threads that once held a continent's ecosystems together were severed all at once. It is in this deep twilight of Australia's ecological past that we confront the convergence, the moment when multiple giants vanish together with such precision that even the silence begins to echo. What makes this convergence so haunting is not merely the simultaneity, but the absence of the usual markers that accompany mass extinction. There is no volcanic ash, no meteorite layer, no surge of disease etched into bones, no catastrophic firestorms preserved in charcoal. Instead, the record dissolves softly, as if the giant stepped into a mist rather than collapsed into a grave. A few fossil sites, like Lake Calabana, preserve hints of suffering, Diprotodon skeletons grouped as if trapped in mud, entire herds succumbing together. But even these scenes are ambiguous. Are they snapshots of climate stress, or merely accidents in dangerous, unpredictable wetlands? Nearby layers that should contain evidence of recovery or continued decline are missing. Instead, the page turns abruptly to a different world, one populated by smaller animals, more agile species, environments reshaped but not shattered. This absence of a rising crescendo, no prelude, no escalation, defies the logic of extinction. Large species rarely vanish without leaving transitional signatures, shrinking body sizes, reduced ranges, genetic bottlenecks. But here, the collapse behaves more like a boundary, a threshold, a line that once crossed, the giants do not appear again. The land loses them not slowly, but in a single enigmatic shift. Researchers have attempted for decades to map this convergence against climatic data. Drought intensifies. Yes. Vegetation changes. Yes. Waterholes shrink. Yes. But none of these lines intersect sharply enough to explain the collapse. The climate graphs slope gently, while the extinction graphs drop vertically. How can slow change produce a sudden ending? Some propose a cascade effect. If certain key species declined, others dependent on them would follow. But this argument loops back to the same unresolved question. What triggered the initial decline? Why did the most robust, most adaptable giants weaken first? The extinction pattern behaves as though the environment itself changed state, moving from one equilibrium to another too quickly for megafauna to follow. Then there is the puzzle of survivorship. Smaller kangaroos endure, emus endure, wombats endure, even many predators endure. This selectivity, where large-bodied species collapse while smaller ones persist, does point toward ecological stress. But stress alone cannot explain the absence of transitional fossils. Where are the last megafauna individuals? Where are the scattered remains of shrinking populations? Where are the late survivors clinging to isolated refuges? The land holds none. Or rather, the land holds fragments, but never enough to build a full picture. One begins to suspect that the story of extinction has been edited, not consciously, but stratigraphically. That the same forces stressing the animals also altered the land's ability to preserve them. The drying lakes, shifting dunes, seasonal floods, and unpredictable storms of the late Pleistocene may have created preservation filters sharp enough to erase the record of decline, leaving only the faint outline of collapse. This possibility becomes clearer when looking at cave systems. Many preserve deep histories stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Yet in the extinction window, sedimentation becomes erratic. Some caves show gaps of 2,000 or more years, precisely the interval in which megafauna vanish. Others show disturbance layers, sediments churned, missing, rearranged. It is as though the land's memory faltered in the same breath that the giants did. But beyond geology lies the unsettling role of time itself. The extinction horizon does not present as a sharp barrier, but as a blurred zone, a temporal fog through which animals fade unevenly depending on the location. In some regions, Diprotodon may have survived longer than elsewhere. In others, Genyornis may have persisted when the rest were gone. These anomalies hint not at sudden death, but at a slow and uneven retreat, one obscured by the incomplete record. And yet slow retreats leave trails. Australia shows few. Then comes the most disquieting contradiction. Evidence hints at megafauna persistence past their supposed extinction date. A Diprotodon bone with unexpectedly young radiocarbon readings. A Genyornis-like eggshell in a layer dated later than expected. A trackway showing giant footprints seemingly younger than the last fossil remains. Each anomaly exists at the margin of certainty. Perhaps errors, perhaps contamination, perhaps displaced layers. But taken together, they whisper a possibility the sediment refuses to confirm. That the giants did not vanish all at once, but their traces did. Such hints draw the imagination toward a more complex ending. Not extinction as a moment, but as a process. Not elimination, but obscuration. Perhaps the giants lingered in dwindling pockets, scattered across shrinking habitats. Perhaps they survived longer than the layers suggest, their numbers too few, their remains too scattered to be captured by chance. And when they finally died, the land simply did not record it, leaving the final chapter blank. This blankness becomes especially pronounced when considering interactions with humans. If humans witness the last of the giants, where are the stories of their end? Where are the tales of the final Diprotodon, the last thunderbird, the fading of Megalania? Instead, the stories describe a world where such beings existed once, but not how they stopped. It is as though the ending occurred outside the narrative frame. This convergence of missing stories, missing bones, missing layers, draws the mind toward the symbolic, toward the possibility that extinction here is not a single event, but a veil, a quieting of the land's breath, a turning of the continent's deep rhythms toward forms better suited to drought, fire, scarcity, and unpredictability. And yet, the more one tries to approach the cause, the further it retreats. All that remains is the shape of the void, the outline of something that once filled the continent with life, now replaced by silence. As we near the end of this journey, the land becomes quieter still. The giants have fallen. The predators have faded. The water has shrunk. The forests have thinned. The stories have blurred. And the record has broken. What remains now is not an explanation, but a question. A question that has lingered for 40,000 years, suspended between geology, memory, and absence. And it is into that question that the final part leads. There is a moment when following the trail of Australia's vanished giants to its end, where one realizes that the creatures themselves were never the true mystery. It was never only about the massive wombats or the towering kangaroos, never only about the predatory reptiles, the colossal birds. the lions without manes, or the crocodiles that ran on long upright legs. The deeper mystery, the one that settles like dusk over the final moments of this story, is the silence that follows them. It is a silence that feels thick, curated, almost intentional. A silence that does not simply mark the absence of life, but the absence of explanation, of continuity, of the bridges that should connect one world to the next. If extinction were a clean event, the record would show it. Layers of bones, sequences of decline, signatures of environmental trauma. If humans had hunted the giants to oblivion, the landscape would whisper of conflict, spears embedded in bone, kill sites preserved by chance. If climate alone were responsible, the shifts would align clearly with ecological collapse. But none of these narratives fit comfortably. The giants do not end with a bang or even a whimper. They dissolve. They thin out into a gray zone where evidence grows faint, sediments grow inconsistent, and the texture of the land itself begins to feel slippery, as though time lost its grip. Perhaps extinction here was not an event, but a fading, a long unwinding masked by the incompleteness of the record. Perhaps the giants lingered longer than we think, scattered across shrinking pockets where water and vegetation persisted. Perhaps they died out quietly, one by one, in places where nothing remained to preserve them. But even this comforting idea falters beneath the insistence of the timelines, which compress the disappearances into a narrow corridor, while expanding uncertainties around every attempted measurement. The land seems almost complicit in its refusal to reveal. One moment the giants stride across its surface. The next, the surface holds nothing of them. Stories become myth. Sediment becomes absent. Bones become rare. The boundary between presence and absence blurs until the giants exist only in fragments. Scattered teeth, a few vertebrae, a trace of eggshell, a set of claw marks on a cave wall. And so one begins to see that the giants are not simply missing. Something in the land's remembering is missing. There is a concept in some indigenous traditions, not about extinction, but about transformation. The idea that the world does not end abruptly. It shifts. It reorganizes itself. Beings change form, or retreat into hidden places, or move into realms where the living no longer see them. These stories, symbolic in nature, should not be taken literally. Yet they contain a poetic truth. The understanding that change often happens in ways that escape direct observation. Perhaps this is why the absence of the giants feels so unsettling. Not because we know nothing, but because we know too little of the transition. We see the before, we see the after. But the middle, the passage between, is a fog. What remains in this fog are impressions rather than answers. A marsupial lion climbing a cave wall. A giant bird laying its last heavy egg. A reptile with venomous jaws moving silently through tall grass. A Diprotodon herd sinking into lakebed mud. A crocodile sprinting across dry earth in search of prey. All these images flicker at the edges of the imagination, then sink back into the sedimentary gaps that refuse to preserve them fully. In the absence of clarity, one must confront the limits of knowledge. Fossils tell stories only through chance. Sediments preserve only what survives the violence of time. Oral histories endure only what is retold with care. And still, threads slip away. Entire species pass through epochs without leaving enough behind to anchor their existence securely. The land erodes. Memories fade. Worlds end without record. And yet, the silence itself carries meaning. It suggests that Australia's transformation was not merely ecological, but structural. Something that reshaped not only life, but the conditions under which life could be remembered. The drying of lakes, the shifting of winds, the repatterning of fire, the migration of people. All these forces intersected in ways too complex to reconstruct cleanly. The giants did not fall to a single cause. They fell into a new world. In that sense, their disappearance is less a mystery than a mirror. It reflects the reality that deep time is uneven. That history is not a continuous line, but a series of recoveries and losses. That some chapters survive intact, while others crumble into dust. And that life, even at its grandest and most formidable scale, can slip into silence with astonishing ease. What remains, then, is not certainty but humility. To look upon ancient Australia is to stand at the edge of an ocean of time and realize how little of its depth we can measure. The giants remind us not only of what once lived, but of how much has vanished without trace. They remind us that the earth does not guarantee remembrance. That species, no matter how powerful, how massive, how dominant, can disappear in ways that leave no story behind. In the end, perhaps the question is not why the giants disappeared, but why their disappearance feels different, why it unsettles, why it lingers, why the silence resonates so deeply. It may be because the land's refusal to reveal is itself a kind of story, one that hints at the fragility of knowledge, the impermanence of records, the impossibility of fully grasping a world so ancient it existed before memory took its first breath. And so we arrive at the final thought, that prehistoric Australia was not merely a place of dangerous animals or colossal forms, but a place shaped by a rhythm of emergence and erasure. A place where life rose in monstrous beauty and then receded into shadows. A place where silence carries the weight of vanished worlds. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of these giants. Not their size, or their strength, or their ferocity, but the quiet they left behind. A quiet that forces us to listen more closely. A quiet that reminds us how easily even the greatest beings can be forgotten. A quiet that asks softly and without insisting on an answer. What else, hidden beneath the erosion of time, has disappeared so completely that we no longer even know to look for it? The continent does not reply. It never does. It simply rests beneath the sun and the stars, holding its secrets as it always has, with patience, with silence, and with the strange, haunting calm of a world that remembers only what it chooses to keep.